Hello, Matt.
Hey Graham, lovely to see you.
Great to see you. Welcome, everyone, to Crazy in Love, the podcast where two couples therapists talk about all things to do with relationships. Today, Matt, we are going to delve into the manosphere like a lot of cultural commentators at the moment. It's everywhere at the moment, isn't it? In terms of
Lord help us, huh?
people talking about various podcast hosts, Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson. But then, of course, we've had a recent Netflix documentary, which a lot of people will have seen, or
Yeah,
at least
yeah,
seen commentary about Louis Theroux. I think it's called Inside the Manosphere or Into the Manosphere.
something like that. Yes, yeah,
Really quite striking documentary that has scared quite a lot of people, I think it's fair to say, in terms of who
yeah,
these cultural influences are and what messages they are communicating to particularly young men in our
yeah.
society. We want to come to this conversation primarily through the lens of relationships, so we'll make sure we keep coming back to that, but help us understand what it is we're actually talking about, because from what I can see, there's an awful lot of different attitudes and perspectives included in that term manosphere. So let's just be
Yeah, it's a bit all over the place, isn't it?
it is.
Really,
Yeah.
and I think that is a big part of the challenge, and there's a lot of panic about it as well. And there's some distasteful stuff that comes out of it. Like there's no way of sidestepping that. But I suppose our stance is but some of this is silly, and some of this was ever thus. It's young men, isn't it? I think that's part of what we would want to say about it. I think there is a broader conversation which is less about the manosphere, which might typically be seen as a facet of internet life, and more about the changing role of men and boys in society. So I think, as well as talking about the manosphere, I think we should talk about men because that's probably what we're a bit better qualified to talk about, men and boys that
Yeah.
we see in therapy and the things that kind of go wrong for them. And I suppose my start point would be to say it feels like, I mean, this is perhaps a generous reading, but it feels like it grows out of loneliness and rejection. That's sort of
What does?
that sort of sense of being alienated, being at war with the world, being aggressive in your attitudes towards other men, weaker men, soy boys, or women
Yes.
feels like it's driven by something which is you're
Yeah.
not getting what's yours, or what you thought was yours,
Yeah.
or what used to be yours, or what your dad got. That kind of thing.
Yeah. Which at the more extreme end of the manosphere turns into conspiracy theory, doesn't it? It turns into
Sure.
red pill stuff around the whole system is built uh, to undermine people like me, young men like me, and we should detest the people who set up and prolong this system, including women, including, as you say, soy boy cucks,
Yeah.
and including fundamentally, we don't want to talk about this too much tonight, but Jews as well. It
Yeah. Sure. Sure.
often comes back to that classic trope of
Yeah.
systems designed by people who don't want to
Yeah.
allow me to break through.
It's just often like really muddle-headed as well. So I
Oh,
mean, Louis Theroux's got a kind of he's got a brand, doesn't he? But Louis Theroux, by any definition, is a powerful man. He's got a big platform. He's a very successful guy. He's a highly desirable, high-value man. And in the documentary, they look at him sort of to them, he looks like a weak kind of guy, potentially. Interesting, Louis Theroux can do 30 push-ups on the bounce as well, which is a pretty decent feat of
yeah,
strength. But
yeah. At
there's
one
a
point
guy
in
who,
the documentary, he literally says, "Are you looking at my arms?" Doesn't he? Is it?
yes, yeah, exactly that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's an interesting book called The Lost Boys, which is written by a guy called James Bloodworth. It was reviewed in The Economist recently, and he says that many men, even most men, enter the manosphere in those spaces, whatever they are. I think people probably know enough to have their own thoughts about what they are, but he said they enter into those spaces following romantic failure, and his book is really that's the lens through which it looks. It's not so much about hating women, it's more about feeling invisible to them, and I think it's probably worth drawing a distinction there. I think it can spill into that kind of hatred. There's certainly plenty of those examples you'll find, but the entry route is often that sort of love lost or love not found. So I thought that was kind of it's an interesting lens through which to look through. Again, you might find that a bit too charitable. I don't know.
No, I don't find it too charitable. I think it speaks to what a significant proportion of those young men are looking for, I think, and makes me think of those stats that you see from time to time about dating choices on dating apps, and how there is quite a bit of statistical truth to the idea that women generally are choosing a very small proportion of men on those apps, and there is a large majority of men that rarely get chosen, and they to be shorter, less attractive men who in the modern dating world are struggling to find sexual attraction coming their way, romantic interest coming their way.
And I suppose that's the bit we come in on, where we see guys who are in that position as well. So much of our work is with couples, and some of our work is with people who are individuals in a couple, or individuals, you know, looking for a relationship, having just come out of a relationship, those kinds of things. So I talk to lots of guys about the challenges of dating, and that one feels really real for them. He says in that book, Lost Boys, that the sort of misogynistic myths end up providing the plausibility, you know, that society is gynocentric. It's like set up and geared for women. It favors and prefers women, you know, that it's only the elite men that can attract women. And I think if you're just online dating, that would potentially resonate, you know, and if you're having a lot of failure in that space and you weren't using other spaces, and you didn't have female friendships or, you know, female co-workers around you, those kind of things, you could see how that would create a kind of slipstream, I guess.
Yeah. And then quite easy to find and slip into online spaces that reinforce an existing worldview and further embed it. And that's where some of those influences in the Theroux documentary scare a lot of parents, particularly, I think, don't they? That I don't know what my kids are searching for. I know that they're a bit quiet. I know they're going through a difficult time, but I don't really know how to get through to them. And I think what we're saying is that we do see quite a few of those young men who are struggling, who haven't necessarily got the kind of more extreme hate-filled vitriol that some of those influences have in the documentary. But they're certainly feeling quite lost.
I wondered if we wanted to use that as a sort of pivot or segue to some of the you know, stuff that underlines this, maybe some more sort of societal shifts. I don't think we want to get lost in this, but maybe tell us a bit about what it looks like for men at the moment in terms of employment opportunities and young women accelerating past them in educational spheres, those kind of points. Probably take us a bit broader than the manosphere itself. Let's get out of the manosphere. Let's get out of the
manosphere. I think before we go into specific stats necessarily, let's just take a broader view, more macro view of Western economies have shifted so dramatically in the last 50 years, with women entering the workforce increasingly, but also the need for two full-time salaries to drive a lot of households, that mean that traditional role as the male, as the breadwinner, as the head of the household has massively diminished in the last 50 years. I don't think we want to talk about kind of shifts in the economy too much tonight, but broadly, those old kind of blue collar jobs, working class jobs that defined masculinity as well as a man's role in society have dried up, quite literally dried up in certain places. Those all have an impact on meaning and purpose in life. I think, you know, movies like Fight Club do a brilliant job of showing the kind of nihilistic response to boring bureaucratic office jobs, that even if you do have a decent job that maybe pays even more than a blue collar working class job used to pay, there's a sense of weakness and bureaucracy and the jobs being boring and meaningless that just all adds up to a large group of relatively young men feeling like they don't quite have that defined role in their society, even when they do have decent education and decent employment.
No, I agree. I think they're all really important points. And boys slipping behind a little bit I was about to make a very broad statement. Boys slipping behind in educational terms. You'd want to unpack that a bit. This is not the podcast for that, but there's definitely, as girls advance, there is an implication for boys there as well, huh?
Yeah, there's an implication. I think there's a class lens as well that we're not going to go
Sure.
into tonight,
Yeah.
where it's predominantly working class boys that someone like Richard Reeves
Yes.
is particularly focused on in his analysis
Yeah.
of the problem. I think there's a strong case to be made there, and I think there's probably a geographical lens. They tend to
Yeah.
be kind of coastal towns as opposed to inner city towns
Yep.
nowadays.
Yep.
There's a
Yep.
great deal of worry about young men in coastal towns. But again, let's not go into that too much today, because our
Yeah.
job is to kind of look at what the impact of all this is. I'm conscious, though, that there'll be people listening who are probably thinking we're already being a bit soft. We're already being justifying something that shouldn't be
Yeah.
justified.
Yeah.
And that some of those views expressed in the documentary that they'll have seen are so extreme.
Yeah.
We're coming in and saying, here's why we kind of understand that some of this stuff is attractive to young men, and understand why a lot of men are feeling lost. What are any kind of thoughts on that?
Well, I just maybe before we do that, I just wanted
Yeah.
to say, like, what Richard Reeves, who I think is an interesting figure in this space, says is that societies have rightly focused on advancing women's needs, right?
Yeah.
So we take that as a good, that is feels like an uncontroversial statement to make. But what he also says is that they haven't adapted quickly enough to new male vulnerabilities. You could choose different language, you could frame that a bit differently if you wanted to. So he is pushing for some policy prescriptions in that space, which again, I don't think we should get into, but starting school early for boys, those kind of things, more vocational pathways. And
I'm not convinced, I've got to be honest, by any of that stuff.
no,
But
I don't know whether it adds up to a hill of beans. I think my own experience of school as a young man and my experience of school as a father to two young men is it definitely favors sitting still and crafting, and it doesn't favor boys being kinetic and expressing themselves. There is an absence of competition in certain environments. Those things are not always wholly promoted. So I think there's something going on this. I wasn't really trying to sidestep what you were asking for, but I think there is something about there is something genuine about some policy challenges in a space of what we do for and with young men
yeah,
that probably does need to be considered, which really is out with I don't know, detestable, ridiculous attitudes that they might hold towards women.
I agree.
But where do we go from here? I guess we could also talk about media hype, couldn't we? Which I suppose is part of what I want to say in response to your question. Is it all terribly serious, and ought we to be very, very concerned about it? Because I guess my stance on it, I mean, you should speak up for that point of view if you're closer to it. But I guess my stance is it feels a little bit like a moral panic. It feels a little bit like, yep, it's unpleasant in parts for sure, but some of the fears feel exaggerated.
I think that's right, and in a moment I'll mention a couple of stats that reassure me about that. But I think it speaks to a broader point about us as a society being terrified of young men, and
Yep.
we're
Yep.
almost looking as a culture to find evidence that young men are more violent than ever, more sexist than ever, more
Yeah.
homophobic than ever. Just we don't like seeing young men in public generally.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
don't want to really, and I think the response to the Louis Theroux documentary really underlined this for me to some degree. We don't want to listen to young men.
Yeah. Sure.
We almost want to kind of tell them to stop being angry, tell them to stop being lonely, tell them to kind of pull their pants up and get on with it in a way
Yeah. Sure.
just feels to me like hand waving the problem away rather than taking it seriously.
They are the dangerous group, aren't they? I think. Like, so if you
100%.
think about criminal justice, it is made up of, what we would broadly call young men. There are some older men in the system. Many of them have been in the system from the age of being young and are still there because they've done something very serious. So very few women and older men ending up in prison. Absolute rump of that prison population, the static population and the churned population that comes in and out of prison are young men. They're our danger. We worry about them for a reason. I think you're making a slightly separate point. Are they now inherently more dangerous than they were in in earlier decades?
Well, I think the point I'm making is that you can respond to that truth in two ways. You can either say, okay, well, what do we do about that? How do we take that seriously? We absolutely, the vast majority of violent crime, and particularly certain types of violent crime, are committed by young men, 'twas ever thus, right? I think there's some biological and evolutionary reasons for that we can't hand wave away, but we can either respond to that by taking that issue seriously, or we can respond to it again, like some of the commentary has been over the last few weeks, which is young men are the problem. And we want to just reinforce this idea that young men are a problem group, rather than we want to take anything seriously in terms of listening to them and responding positively and proactively to some of the challenges that they face. It's almost like those problems, if you try and engage with the idea that those problems should be taken seriously, it's like you're justifying some of the
horrible, I was going to try. I agree with all of that. I was going to try and take us back to relationships, because we might be failing to make the connections, I guess, although it's an interesting discussion. One of the ways in which to maybe gently segue to that is to say that one of the theories in criminal justice is that you age out of crime.
Definitely.
So it doesn't sound terribly.
I don't think it's a theory. I think it's a fact.
It's a reality based on empirical data. So it sounds a bit rubbish and thin, doesn't it? It's like, oh, so what do? We just wait for them to grow up, and that is part of what you do. They literally age out. But the two sort of things that happen within that aging out process is not that they've gotten older, not necessarily even that they've gotten much wiser. There might be something about prefrontal cortexes, but what happens is they get a job and they get a girlfriend. That's typically the route. And I suppose that's also the link to what we've been talking about. How easy is it to get a job that means something to you and pays your way in the world, enables you to contribute, and how easy is it to get a girlfriend?
Yes, yeah, good. That just made me think about kind of professional sports people and how often they're very young men, and there's a culture within that of getting married quite young. A lot of young footballers, for example, professional footballers, get married young.
Yeah.
They almost deliberately are creating a kind of structure and a sense of purpose and meaning and something secure that they can focus on, as opposed to having way too much spare time to just follow their nose.
And old school managers love it. That's what they want for them, right?
Exactly.
Those are the ones that are easier to manage. I've got a guy who I was working with a fair old while back now, but he said he wanted as his chief exec for his enterprise, he was an investor of some sort, a guy who's married with a mortgage, super steady, loads of skin in the game, and the kind of, the good stress of a mortgage, somebody who really wants to do a good job, hit those markers, that they tie us to something, don't they? They tether us to something. And the young men who are dangerous are the ones who've just got no skin in the game, no place, no stake in society.
And is your perspective then that isn't getting that much worse from what you can see?
I don't know whether it is. I mean, I definitely don't feel like I have the numbers on that. What I do have is a lot of men of all sorts of different ages. I mean, brackets young, if you go up to about sort of 30, 35, which I do still consider young, they struggle to get, they struggle to date in the way that we would have dated in the past. So it's almost all online. You're going to have a hard job doing this without using the apps. And the apps do the kind of thing that you were talking about earlier. They favor certain types of people, and they drive that. Once you're favored, then you're favored. And it's sort of, from your perspective, if you're in that category of people, I suppose it's a virtuous circle. But for others, it's you can't get traction. And so you're getting a lot of repeat messages that you're undesirable. That's what I hear a lot. And then I think the Manosphere, but other online spaces tell you to be a high value man, tell you how to be a man, tell you how to conduct yourself, give you ideas and notions about what women would like and what they would accept.
That's interesting. So let's stay with that for a little bit. The proposed answer to that is it's often things like work out a lot.
Sure.
It's focus on yourself, make yourself more desirable, earn decent money.
Yeah, earn decent money really quickly as well, isn't it? I think the Manosphere stuff is side hustles and like really sort of almost illegitimate ways to make money, or ways that make you money quickly but don't necessarily compound over time. When I see those young men that are profiled as part of the Louis Theroux documentary, is this a life? Is this really going to work over the next 5 to 10? I suspect strongly it's not.
I suspect strongly it's built on a pile of a debt and a house of cards that will come crashing anytime soon. it's unachievable for the
Yeah.
vast
Yeah.
majority of men that they're selling that
Yeah.
dream to. And I think they know it. I think fundamentally a lot of their views are built on making money as opposed to anything other than that. I think if they could make money quick doing something of social value, I think they'd do something of social value. I think it was all about making money and making money quick.
Yeah.
That is just
Yeah.
not feasible for the
No.
vast majority of young men they're talking to.
There's probably an overlap with crime there as well, literally, but there's something about the way crime purports to make you money quickly and probably land you inside a prison. In truth, there's something seductive about those things. There is something seductive about crime and violence. Like one of the sort of quirky criminologists talks about that you've got to overcome that. For some young men, it's not that they did it because they didn't have any other opportunities and it's grim and it's sad. They're loving it. They're loving their life. They're enjoying it. And I think you see that in some of the people profiled by Louis Theroux. He invites one of them to reflect on whether they couldn't have done something more positive, whether they couldn't have helped people, for example, rather than appeal to their baser instincts. And it sort of catches him cold. And he says, probably could have, At one point, he would have been quite a promising young man. And then he says something like, well, I wouldn't have gotten famous if I just posted that kind of content.
Yeah.
Which sort of seemed to me to be a moment in the documentary. It's not the one that got clipped very much, but that was the thing that sort of spoke to me. That there was,
am I hearing you right that you think that that's about kind of validation needs, as opposed to for me, I came away from that documentary thinking these are young men that just want to make loads of money, and they'll do it in whatever way they can, and they'll say whatever they need to say, no matter how offensive and extreme, to keep the clicks, to keep people on their channels, to keep the money coming in. It doesn't really matter if they believe that stuff or not. Or
no, I don't think for a moment they believe it. Like I think the anti-Semitic stuff came from nowhere. It seemed entirely unmotivated. I just wouldn't have any confidence that they've really got a very strong grasp of history, or the role of Jewish people within history, or persecutions that have taken place, crimes. I just think they would be all at sea on that. I just don't really. I mean, it's real and it's deeply unpleasant. It's some of it's probably even criminal in nature to say it, but it seemed to be what my wife said about the documentary is so silly. They're so silly, and I thought that's actually quite a it wasn't an off the cuff comment.
No,
it's like that's that's what emerges, I think, from the documentary.
I think I said to you off mic that it reminds me of WWE wrestling a lot. It's like these muscly men with these overly exuberant personalities saying whatever needs to be said. That it's like pantomime. It doesn't feel like an accident that it's all happening at the same time as what's going on in American politics, for example. Not from one end of the spectrum or the other, but just the kind of bombastic nature of claims and counterclaims and lies that is pervasive, particularly at the moment.
I would fully accept I see a skewed sample of the population, but the women I see who are wanting to date, who've come out of relationships or who reflect on what was a successful relationship or facets of a successful relationship, never describe the manosphere. They never describe hateful guys or guys who are building a thing that could collapse tomorrow or could end anybody in imprisonment or any of those things. So some of what I'm saying to young men, none of whom of the young men I see are anywhere really remotely near the manosphere, but they are confused about what women might want, and they are confused about some of the messaging, I think, that is current at the moment. I just don't see those things being desirable, which is why I see it as a bit silly. I don't doubt some people would have their head turned by flash car rented by the hour and whatever else, and could get drawn into it. But the idea that that is actually what's wanted, or that actually represents a dating strategy or a way to demonstrate your value in the world, seems just so palpably false.
And the vast majority of young men, you hope, would find that out pretty quickly, that they're going to find out, even if they are bought into some of these ideas, that it's just going to fail as miserably as previous strategies, right?
Yeah. Where do you want to go from here? I
wanted to mention a couple of the statistics that drove some of this thing.
Yeah, good idea.
One of the striking stats that a lot of people have linked to the Theroux documentary is a recent study that suggested that about 40% of Gen Zers, so those born around kind of the year 97 to 2005, something like that, I think it is, So mainly men who would be coming into their kind of 20s, mid-20s at the moment. About 40 odd percent of them think it's appropriate for women to obey their husbands, so wives to obey their husbands at all times, right? Scary stat on the face of it. When you dig a little bit deeper and you do it country by country, you find actually it's for men in the UK, that number drops down to about 13%. Still a scary figure. You're talking about 1 in 10 men.
Yeah.
But then if you really question, what do they actually mean in that circumstance? What does that actually look like? And even if they did say it in a survey, what would you see if you put a camera on the walls in the homes of those men and with their wives, full of bombast when they're responding to a survey? Do they actually believe that? Do they actually behave in that way? I'm less convinced on that. One of the other studies that provides me with quite a bit more relief, I'll give credit to, I think it was Owen Winter in The Economist, where I found this. The British election study of 2024 suggests that it's probably only about 7, 8, 9% of men in their 20s agree with 3 statements. Those statements are: most women fail to appreciate fully all that men do for them. Secondly, women seek to gain power by getting control over men. And thirdly, most women interpret innocent remarks or acts as being sexist.
Yeah.
Now, the important thing from my point of view is not the number, is the fact that men in their 40s, according to that survey, have way more sexist attitudes towards women, than men in their 20s. So there's this big cultural surge about we need to focus on the manosphere and its impact on boys who are 18 to 25, say, when it's actually men like you and me in midlife who seem to have, apart from men in maybe their 70s.
So this is another podcast, Graham. We can't do that.
The kind of values that we're talking about. Ironically enough, of pretty much all the cultural commentators who are saying we should be worrying about men in their 20s.
Well, I agree. And I want to say a couple of things off the back of that. I thought that's helpful stuff. One is when I see young men, they're lovely. I love seeing them. They're like, they're a joy to be with. They come from all walks of life. I've seen them in different geographic locality. They're really fun, and
you mean
they're also really
and personally though, right? You're not just talking clinically, you're talking kind of,
no, they've got sort of rich lives, and what they do with their friends, which would have been sort of unthinkable with mine, is they're really free with their emotions. They genuinely tell each other they love one another, they greet each other in a warm way. They're huggy, they're demonstrative, so the idea that they're holding these kind of pernicious attitudes, I mean, normal distribution and all that, isn't it? Sure, there are some outliers in this, but the young men I see are much more fluent with their feelings, more able to draw on support, more likely to talk about the kind of stuff that I think women and other commentators in this space would have them do. So I see a lot of that. So when I hear the manosphere, sort of, I'm not sure what we're calling this, but something like the boys are all right, and the kids are all right, the boys are all right, I think there's real signs of hope if you get to know those young men. I wonder what school teachers would say in the main. I know that there'll be examples and that they will have dealt with this as an issue in schools and that they'll be attuned to it. But I wonder what your average, GCSE science teacher is really, seeing.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There's also a little bit of silliness with boys as well, isn't there? And I hope this is okay to say, but a lot of messing around, like banter and bants, is a big deal, right? That is what they do. They do silly things and they do transgressive things. And some of that, I don't think that bit was drawn out in the documentary.
What do you mean by transgressive? What do you mean?
Well, that they like to push the limits, that they like to do and say stupid things, that they muck around in schools. That's what young boys do, not all of them, but lots of them, The thing that I thought Louis Theroux could have brought out, like, he's a big rap fan. He's on Rang and Nathan's podcast talking about, rap and talking about all of those influences, the language in the rap that he would have listened to, that Romesh would have listened to, would have terrified their parents and their parents' generation, So I sort of felt like Louis been there, when I see some of not the hateful stuff, but the stupid stuff that young men do. My son at the moment has a Alpha Wolf as his picture on WhatsApp or one of those socials. Like, it doesn't mean anybody any harm. He's seen it, he thinks it looks cool, and he's adopted it. And in hopefully less than 6 months, he will realize it's somewhat ridiculous and replace it with his sweet little face.
Do you just? I was wondering earlier today about tensions, kind of psychological tensions almost, and build on what you're saying that teenagers are holding two truths inside at one time, that they genuinely do have some problematic feelings and beliefs that they're also trying to square off about with their reality of female friends and
Yeah, yeah,
romantic feelings, and they might have some deeply homophobic feelings about, you know, doing the naturalist fallacy and feeling that feeling of disgust and not knowing what to do with it, but also having gay friends, increasingly openly gay
yeah, sure.
friends, and not quite
Yeah,
knowing
absolutely.
what to do
Yeah,
to square that circle within them, and having spaces where they can be safe to express some of that
yeah,
and
yeah,
play with some of that. I think some of this
yeah.
is play, to be honest, not some of the extreme stuff, obviously.
No,
Some of
no,
this
no.
is play, isn't it? I think just building on your.
It's working it out, finding it
Yeah,
out, isn't it? It's puzzling. It's like a
yeah.
lack of clarity around your identity. It's trying on different disguises, different guises, seeing what works for you, seeing what doesn't. And I think there is risk taking in adolescence, isn't there? And there is risk taking in teenage boys. It's a phenomenon that I think we won't curb.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess uh, someone would rightly say just because it's not getting worse doesn't mean it's not bad. For a lot of
Sure.
women and teenage girls, particularly on the receiving
Yeah.
end of some of this, that we've
Yeah.
probably danced around today, and probably because of
Yeah.
our own experiences don't have the right language maybe, or to describe that. But
No, no, I think I mean, maybe we're thinking about closing off, and I think that
yeah,
is worth acknowledging, isn't it? This is a partial take. There's a very, an aspect of the discussion. I think there's a lot more to say, and I think if you were talking to our wives, they would have said it differently. Don't know what your daughters would say about it. Like that would be genuinely an interesting
well,
discussion around
yeah.
grooming ages and what it's like to be on the receiving end of what we think of as, maybe light-hearted, maybe foolish, maybe misguided, might feel sharper than all of those terms
Uh,
that we've
uh,
applied.
Interestingly, my wife suggested that we get my 13-year-old daughter on to discuss,
Yeah,
but partly in jest, but partly because one of the things we haven't talked about is that girls are listening to a lot of this stuff as well.
sure.
So
Yeah,
my 13-year-old daughter was aware of who Charlie Kirk was when he got
yeah,
assassinated. She was
yeah,
aware of some of his beliefs.
yeah,
She's aware of some of these guys, right? She'll have
yeah,
seen their content too. So just understanding how that's impacting on young women and young girls as well
yeah.
as young men, I think, is an important part of how we talk about this over the next decade or so.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree. And this really is another podcast, isn't it? But girls can be mean, as you and your 13-year-old daughter will know. They can
She's
exclude and
always lovely, Matt. What are you talking about?
they can
Always sweet
exclude
and
and
lovely.
ostracize, and they do that in a different way, right? I think any sort of discussion which is going to say that male human nature is awful and appalling or needs to be treated with extreme caution, and women are somehow more elevated, I think is just again a kind of palpable nonsense.
Oh, it's just it really unhelpful way of framing
Yeah,
anything to sort of suggest that somehow men are dirty, disgusting creatures that need
yeah.
to become more pure in some ways. I don't think is going to
No.
help look the
Or even that
conversation.
women don't engage in conflict,
Yeah,
or don't
exactly,
have a
exactly,
sense of
exactly.
hierarchy, or those
Yeah,
kinds of those
yeah,
things. It's
yeah,
in common, isn't it? It shapes up very differently, but something, there's a sort of joint project there as well.
yeah. Interesting.
Yeah,
I feel just before we sign off, is there anything more though that we want to say about relationships? We maybe haven't talked as much as I would have wanted to in terms of how this
I agree.
does come
Yeah,
through into relationships. I think we probably don't see as much as most, because even the couples we work with tend to be a little bit older, maybe a little bit
yeah,
more skewing towards highly educated, well
yeah,
paid,
yeah,
where
sure.
some of this stuff probably doesn't impact them. But what it does impact is their children. It impacts,
Yeah,
saying, the young
yeah,
men and the young women that we work with
yeah.
individually.
I think how
Anything
you
else you want to.
organize things and how equal it feels, like that's a highly relevant conversation, though, isn't it? So I think if you were allowing that to sort of emerge as a theme from the Manosphere, or say that was something that was
Yeah.
drive in the Manosphere. That does feel like endlessly relevant. You know, who's bringing the money, who's doing more of the labors, you know, who brings the kids up, who does whatever in the home, and just generally how we speak to one another in a, you know, in a respectful way. How do we
Yes.
see the roles? And I see some couples doing
Yeah.
it with real skill and class, doing very
I
different
do.
things, but genuinely honoring what the other one is doing. And in some relationships, it's much more contested, you know, much more unsettled, you know, much more fraught.
Yeah, but even when it's fraught, it tends to generally be two people who are trying their best to make something work and to try and be heard and to hear the other person, which
Yeah.
again is at odds with everything you would have seen and heard in that documentary. It's
Yeah, but it's sort of the only way through anything, isn't it?
the
Really,
only
it's
way
the
through. Absolutely.
prescription for any joint
Yeah.
endeavor in life, whether it be, you
Yeah.
know, politics and organizing a society, or how you couple off with someone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. All right. Any final words?
No. I wanted to wrap it up in a neat bow, but I'm afraid it's eluded me. You've got
Yeah.
the opportunity now, if you'd like.
Well, the only thing I wanted to say is that you've got a red card for using the term bants as part of this conversation. That you just couldn't get through a conversation about the manosphere without using the word bants, which is one of those words that literally makes my toes curl. It just makes me want to scream. But
You are
maybe
bringing the metrosexuality today.
well, maybe I'm bringing masculine anger to the end of the to the conversation.
It's nice
Good.
to see you.
Good to see you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Come on, Graham.